So first of all, Mr. Kuper, thank you very much for having us. Thank you for attending one more time. I knew you've been here back in 2016, right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
At that time, I brought the Spy versus Spy Omnibus for you to sign. That was one of my childhood favorite strips, and I appreciated very much your work, and also from Antonio Projas, the original writer.
Yeah.
So,
I love his work too.
of course. And one important thing is, for the first question is, despite using text as well, most of your stories, or many of your stories, are textless. And for you, how is to dealing with having a lot to say without writing a single word?
Well, I'm writing with the images. And so I actually, in some ways, I prefer it because it strips down the storytelling, and it's like Charlie Chaplin. You can tell so many things without any words, and to me, Modern Times, Charlie Chaplin's movie is one of the great pieces of art ever. And I really, sometimes word balloons get in the way visually, and so it's kind of there's a purity in the form when you can do something without words, and you can really tell a lot of story without having any words involved. I do that every week now for a strip that I do for Charlie Hebdo, the French magazine.
Charlie Hebdo, the weekly newspaper, right?
Exactly, yes.
And how is going your work now? Because that one uses many politics, the weekly. How is going your collaboration in there currently?
Well, I've been doing it for 5 years every week, and it's going great. Unfortunately, because the subject matter is about the environment, and as the environment gets worse, there's more material to talk about. So there's so many different angles on it that I have not run out of any ideas every week to be able to tell a story about how bad things are.
Environment, even here in Brazil and Amazon,
I mean, especially here in Brazil, and that's going, the effect that'll have on the whole planet is gigantic.
Good. And in another scenario, you also did literature adaptations like Franz Kafka and Joseph Conrad. Heart of
Darkness.
Yeah, Heart of Darkness. Thank you very much. And what were the biggest challenges for this time, given graphic movements for and words, doing a graphic movement for words that weren't actually in first place for comics? Because we're books without illustrations. And why did you choose this one?
Well, with something like Kafka, first of all, it's really good to work with dead writers because they don't ever bother you about your choices, right? But with Kafka, a friend of mine was reading Kafka's short stories. Like, we'd have a beer and he'd read a short story, and I realized how funny they were, actually, and also how visual they are. And they've got all the elements that are perfect for comics. Ridiculous environments. Somebody wakes up, they're a bridge. Somebody wakes up, they're a cockroach. So these are ideal for translating into comics. So I found that to be, in many ways, very easy. And his language was, broke down quite simply, where if there's a description of a background and I'm drawing it, I don't have to include that. When I did Joseph Conrad, it was much more complicated because it's a late 19th century book with all of the problematic language, and figuring out a way to make it work for the 21st century just involved that consideration. And by flipping the perspective in Heart of Darkness, so that whereas in his book he's kind of describing the people from the Congo as they're almost like cardboard cutouts. They're not very well described, and they're just sort of like he refers to Africa as just sort of being like a sea of trees. Well, I could draw what was going on inside, behind the scenes, and show much closer up vision of the people. And I think that actually served the story better. It was something that was lacking in Conrad's version that I could bring to it with my 21st century sensibilities, but also I think that it's something that Conrad might have done himself if he had been a 21st century person. It was just like, it's the blind spot of that era. But it was really, I mean, I love writing my own work. I love adapting things. I really enjoy doing Spy versus Spy, which is existing characters. So really, I love comics. So whenever I can do all the different angles, it can be autobiography, it could be fiction, it could be nonfiction. All those areas are interesting to me.
Okay, well, you mentioned Spy versus Spy, so let's talk about this. Because every single strip, you start with the Morse code by Prohias. And for you, did you feel any weight, any responsibility for keep going with somebody else's work, keeping the legacy? And how was for you putting your trademark in something that started with another comic book creator?
Well, probably the reason why I got the job was because I didn't look at it as being this big thing where I was taking on somebody's legacy, and I had to be, really careful and tiptoe around, this important thing. Now, it was very important to me growing up, very important. One of the reasons I do wordless comics. But when they asked me to do it, I had just finished doing The System, which was wordless, and I was doing a weekly strip called Eye of the Beholder, also wordless, and the idea of taking on somebody else's work was not appealing to me, but I thought I'd give it a try. And so I also thought, if I'm going to do that, I'm going to do it in my own style and not try to mimic Prohias. So I did it in stencils and spray paint, thinking that they would hate it, and they would just say, okay, thank you very much, Mr. Kuper, you can go home now. And instead, it turned out that was exactly why they wanted me. So I was taking it on really in a kind of a punk way, because I was just being like, I don't care, knocking, kicking the wall over while I walked into the room. But then once I got involved with it, my appreciation for what Prohias was doing only increased, and it was a great opportunity. It was like a playground for using symbols and playing with the incredibly wide possibilities that Prohias set up. They can be old, they can be cavemen, they can be, in space, they can be underground. There's so many different angles you can take on it. And then with new technology, I kept finding new ways to come up with, ways for them to destroy themselves. Okay. So it ended up being, a fortunate turn that I was not terrified by trying to take on a responsibility as you described it.
Thank you. So we are going to the last question. And in the ruins in Oaxaca, you talk about principally Mexico, and the Mayan thing, including this is about a travel, right? And do you consider your work more journalistic on these? And how was for you assuming going with this identity of like a new journalism and reporting?
Well, I traveled a lot throughout my life, and on one trip with my wife, we went to Africa and Southeast Asia for 8 months, and I was doing comics about that travel, and that was sort of journalistic too. And I was always fond of using comics, again, all the different ways you can do it. One of them is to do journalism, to tell this kind of story. I kind of stumbled into the journalistic aspect in Oaxaca because there was this teacher strike, and I was there, and it was in front of me, and when I started to draw it, I was kind of like, I found myself in the middle of telling a story that there weren't actually journalists around to tell. Most of the journalists had left Oaxaca and were reporting from Mexico City. And so then I felt kind of a responsibility that I had this chance to tell a deeper story because I was living in Oaxaca for 2 years. And the first 7 months was during this teacher's strike. So it was just, I was a participant in at least, on the edge of it. And so Diario de Oaxaca is my sketchbook and writing from the 2 years. And then Ruins is kind of taking that information and doing it as a fictional account where I could put characters, not exactly me and my wife, but younger characters, made up characters, in the middle of things based on all the information I had. I wouldn't have been able to do it without having lived there and had this research in as intimate a way as I did. But that really came out of, sort of that exploring it from living there and then kind of being a journalist and then translating that into a graphic novel in the form of Ruins.
So that's really interesting. I would like to talk about this in another occasion. For this, that's it. Thank you very much, Mr. Kuper.
My pleasure.